Righto, money miners. Our apparent love for the AFR continues because we've got another one.
Our love for Pete.
We're not sponsored by him or anything, just to be clear. But, mate, Mr. Peter Kerr come back for another 2024 recap since the 2023 resources one went so well. And Anthony McDonald has just kindly not turned up or I'm off him.
People are going to think there's some media mega merger happening. That this is like a data room, and AFR people are just coming in. And,
Mate,
you said it, Pete.
Speculation lifts the value. It's all good. We're already trading at a premium.
We'll get the Australian on next week.
Yeah. Better get Brad Thompson in, just a bit of competition.
Yeah. Oh, no, we chewed through all the honey he gave us last year, so we we need some. Boys, as we said, I think the one we did with Miss Jenny Hewitt last week was more probably policy, politics, energy focused, but we're really going to hone in on the resources today, which is Mr. Kerr's sweet spot. I assume it still is, Peter.
Well, I'll let your listeners be the judge.
Yes. How has your year been as the top resource journo in Australia? I've given you that title.
Oh, thanks. I'll run with it. Look, I'm going to admit, I was surprised by BHP Anglo. That's obviously the biggest thing in the room when we talk about 2024. And in hindsight, maybe I shouldn't have been surprised, but I sort of give myself an out for being surprised because I, in hindsight, don't think it was a great move. I think they possibly played it wrong. I thought it was a bit ugly. I thought it was unwieldy, a bit complicated. Full points to them for being agile and moving when they thought they saw a moment of weakness. But I suspect in the year or two ahead, we might see that situation get a lot more simplified and perhaps an easier deal. So I guess that stands out for me as the biggest thing in the year. And of course, just the continuation of this battery metal slump. I think coming into January, we all knew it was probably going to be a tough year for this sector, and Liontown and Nickel West were going to be the bellwethers, if you like, of that downturn. I'm surprised that Nickel West got shut. I thought a federal government with a well-publicised mandate and policy to have domestic onshore processing would have found a way to throw enough money at BHP to keep that open, particularly given WA electorates are so important at the next federal election. So I'm surprised that didn't happen. And I don't think it was through any lack of trying by the federal government either. I think BHP sort of had enough, really. Surprises all round. And I guess I'm still surprised today now that Liontown shares are, in the 60 cent range, depending on which day your listeners listen to this podcast. I don't know. If this time last year it was worth $3 a share to Gina, why isn't it worth 60 cents today? Surprises all around. What about you guys?
Yeah, I think
all of them.
the other big conversation point I'm keen to unpack with you, Pete, is something that the AFR colleagues of yours and self as well have covered in great detail. Everything that's happened corporate governance related with MinRes being a focus, but we've seen stories break just sort of last week on Andrew Forrest and the exec turnover at Fortescue. I think that's kind of the other one that really grabs my attention as big stories for 2024.
That was pretty consistent, wasn't it? When did that was probably the year before, wasn't it? Like when we first started.
Twiggy had a bit of a governance moment over 12 months ago. I remember, Pete, you saying on last year's podcast that he kind of comes out a victor because Fortescue shares were at an all-time high at the back end of the year. I think they're down like 35-38% since then. Whereas iron ore's kind of slumped. It's not really too much governance related, but is he a winner or a loser this year?
Probably a bit of a loser, I reckon, because he's had to concede some ground on this hydrogen clean energy pivot. Of course, Andrew Forrest never concedes entirely, but the key thing he conceded was we're not going to have 15 million tonnes of green hydrogen by 2030. I mean, his investors were probably happy to hear that. That probably sounded like he was still clinging on to rationality rather than just delivering a target for the sake of delivering a target. But I think that took some paint off. I mean, the whole hydrogen sector is just in a world of pain, right? Like up in, the northwest of WA, BP is still clinging to this idea that they're going to do the Australian Renewable Energy Hub, AERH, this vast thing up north of the Pilbara. They've sort of conceded it's not going to be a hydrogen export thing. They're trying to sell the power to the Pilbara miners. The Pilbara miners, I gather, don't really feel like they need it or want it.
Yeah, it's this big offshore wind turbines up in the Pilbara that proposed sites for offshore turbines with a view to potentially electrify the Pilbara. There's no grid in the Pilbara. Where you got to invest,
isn't it?
Yeah,
and it's 500 k's
Exactly.
from the mines, and the miners have no shortage of land. They can do it themselves. But
the
on
Pilbara
forest
is very big. Like you think of the Pilbara as this
enormous.
pocket,
Yeah.
but it's fucking huge.
Yeah.
It is very big.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's right.
I've got a couple others that actually come to mind. One you did a great piece on just on Friday, Mick Philome's, and everything that relates to that. That was an interesting deep dive you did on Friday there, Pete. And just to tie on to the lithium sort of piece as well, Rio Tinto, they have made a massive bet, contrary to every other peer, major miner, on lithium. They've spent north of 15 billion Aussie dollars over the past couple of years now on lithium, assuming the Arcadium deal goes through. And, that to me is Jakob Stausholm's reign will be measured against how that performs, looking back 5-10 years, because that is a big bet to make. And they're the sort of things that I think a CEO gets measured on, because that makes, more weight than any other decision that they might have throughout a, 4 or 5 year standard CEO reign at a major mining company.
And not just lithium brine, DLE. Like the
Exactly, Matt. It's not just a bet on a commodity, is it? It's a bet on DLE, and even a new type of DLE. Like I gather it's a sort of different type of resin that has been developed for that particular geology.
well, one that works.
Is it still geology if it's groundwater? I suppose it kind of is.
Hydrogeology.
Hydrogeology.
Yeah. So it's a huge bet. And you're right, we will have to watch that over the next 5 years or so, and it will become quite defining for Jakob. I think in the short term, and I'm pretty sure you guys observed this on your show a few times, in the short term, that deal has been sentiment negative for WA lithium miners. It really reiterated this idea that brines, which is sort of the idea that everyone had sort of 8 years ago, which is that brines are going to be the low-cost leaders, and WA spodumene would be your higher cost, opportunistic swing supply. And over this 8 year period, we sort of at times drifted away from that idea, whether it was because hydroxide was going to work really well for spodumene, or whether it was because of sovereign risk in South America. So who knows what's going to happen? But right now it does look like the world is saying brines is going to be king in lithium. And I mean, ExxonMobil coming into this sector. I mean, how much dollars have they got to spend? I looked at their capex last week, and they're talking about $33 billion US per year of capex into oil and gas. Like, they have so much money to spend at this. So right now, at sort of Christmas 2024, it looks like lithium supply is going to be really strong in future from the brines. And yeah, it's easy to be a bit pessimistic for spodumene, but I also think one of the most interesting presentations I saw this year on lithium was from Ivan Vella at IGO, where he came out with that strategy update. And he basically, I guess his central theme for the next decade was that lithium's huge roller coaster, the ups and downs, the peaks and troughs, would continue for at least a decade whilst the industry was immature. And I think his thesis at the time was that you just need to design a business in the medium term that can deal with that, that can harvest at the highs, but also survive the lows and not get caught in between, with too much debt in the low moments. So based on the Ivan Vella view of the world, there will be a lithium boom 3.0 that will work for spodumene too. And maybe that's the moment MinRes get their chance to break off lithium. I don't know. Is that still a thing people talk about in Perth?
Oh God, who knows? Is it because do you think the Rio thing? Like, is it also? We talked about brine DLE, but is it also a bet on lithium carbonate, and which is obviously going to be down like shithouse for what the infrastructure that's in place in Australia for downstream hydroxide, and shit for nickel as well? Because it sounds like they're betting on carbonate, which is what because the whole theme changed once LFP, the rise of the LFPs, which take carbonate instead of hydroxide. And this is looking like maybe that's obviously going to be shit for nickel, shit for hydroxide, because Rio are betting big on carbonate, effectively.
Yeah, you're right. That is part of the bet. Although I don't see too many analysts who talk about it as all one or the other. There'll probably be a bit of space for both.
It's like energy. It's going to be a bit of everything.
Yeah, I think that's right. And who knows what's the unknown out there, right? Like there could be some new version of LFP that comes along that has some totally different mix and, needs bloody niobium or something. Who knows? So, yeah, I guess that's the other risk that Jakob's taking is technology risk, right? Like it's a fast-moving, fast-changing sector. What's the battery chemistry going to be in 8 years' time? Possibly different to today.
Well, look how quick it changed what we thought was going to be the future, like just in the last year or two, like 2 years, effectively. So who bloody knows? We could have little nuclear bloody capsules, uranium capsules to chuck in them soon, like a bloody
maybe
EV
the
subs.
or the Duracell AAAs. I mean, don't rule them out.
So Rio, do they get a pass mark from you this year for being, bold and opportunistic, or are you reserved on?
They probably do. Yeah. I don't think they struck out. It's probably a longer term bet, isn't it? I'm trying to think back. Did they add any copper to their business this year?
Well, they I think they made official FID on Simandou as well, which is
that was the year before. That was December last year, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So
I guess OT is sort of ramping up, and they're finally getting there, but it's been long and painful. And we've sort of talked in the past about this Entree situation, which remains unresolved and needs to be unresolved. And for your listeners who aren't familiar with that, Entree are a tiny little company who have a minority interest in some of the tenements that Rio needs to mine relatively soon at Oyu Tolgoi in Mongolia, and is kind of becoming the mouse that roared. They've waited a long time for this moment, but they are getting their moment of what's it called? Leverage.
Big time.
Because it's like a band, isn't it? Like it's not it's an RL dependent like section of the ore body, isn't it?
That's right. So Rio has complete control, if you like, in the middle, and at both the sort of southwestern and I think northeastern end, there are tenements that Rio does not 100% control. And the ones in question for Entree and for the mine plan in the near term are at the northeastern end. And so Rio can't move into those tenements and mine them until they strike a deal with Entree. But there's this complication with the Mongolian government, as there always is in Mongolia. And this, I think part of the hold up, and I could be wrong, but I gather it's something to do with at what point does the Mongolian government take their cut? Do they take a cut of the Entree sort of share of the tenements, before the deal is done to incorporate that into the mine, or do they wait for the deal to be done and then uplift? I think there's a bit of back and forth about the timing there.
Another big theme. One of the big 2024 themes that really hit us over here, Curry, probably not as much over there, was Jesus Christ, the MMS polo shirts in West Perth, Mineral Mining Services. They are, mate, the rise of them. That was pretty much like 100x share price.
Big theme of the year is just the entire emergence, growth, and domination of them as a fully integrated turnkey mining services open pit kind of contractor, but with the technical services expertise to go with it. Mate.
Did they take over a mining consultant or something? Like
all organic growth, mate?
Was it?
Yeah,
I couldn't believe it. Like, because to get the open pit mining services and then just bolt on the tech services, it's like not via M&A, which was unbelievable. It's like they've just it's like they took over Entech or something, but they didn't,
mate. And like you were saying, Kerry, like the timelines to get into production are blowing out. That's a theme. But MMS with the tech services fast track it, and then they mine it.
Yeah, that was
Big 2024 for them.
oh, huge, mate, huge 2024.
You asked the question, Trav. What do you rate the sort of performance? And I'm struggling to think of something higher than an A. A plus plus. Like,
Yeah.
they just knocked it out the park.
Well, if 1 was the highest, you'd have to go 0.
Yeah.
It's all minus 1. Like it's off the scale. Yeah, it's like infinity plus 1.
I'm kind of scared what 2025 could look like when you're growing that fast.
Yeah. I think it's just continue the upward trajectory of MMS and go MMS and Merry Christmas to the MMS team.
Go MMS.
Yeah, that's a logical kind of event catalyst type of opportunities out there at the moment. The other thing that hit, Rio also hit BHP was just this observation of declining grade of their Pilbara iron ore products. Like what's your read of what's going on in the Pilbara, and why are they now kind of putting out lower grade product to market?
So I guess, you would have heard the miners talk about some of the big long-term overarching reasons why that's happening, which is just, the best deposits have been picked over and so forth. Getting, and then starting to go down into the water table and get the less attractive stuff. But heritage is a big part of this as well, right? Like all the iron ore mining projects that we see going through the approvals phase, through the WA or the federal regulators, most of them are coming back with an update to say the envelope size of this development is reduced by 10%, 14%, 21%. We've seen Hancock do it. We've seen Rio do it. We've seen Fortescue do it. And that is because these mining companies are putting in a lot more time and having much more conversations with their traditional owners, the native title custodians in those parts of the world, and perhaps listening to them more and are now carving out sections. And so that gives you a net reduction anyway, but I suspect a lot of these sections are, well, in some cases they have been the high-grade section of resources. This is why Fortescue are only doing, or are doing much less of that West Pilbara Fines product than they promised. So West Pilbara Fines was going to be Fortescue's higher grade hematite product. It was going to be more than 60% iron. They launched it probably 5-6 years ago. And I think it was supposed to get up to something like a quarter of their hematite volumes by now. It's still running down maybe like 9% or something. And that's because a whole bunch of the bits they plan to mine are now ruled out on heritage grounds. So even though, and this is a point we tried to make around McPhillamys, even though the WA state law is pretty much identical today to what it was when Juukan Gorge happened, and federal laws have not changed yet either, the world has changed. like heritage is having a much bigger impact on mining than it was at Juukan Gorge, which just tells you how much things can change without the politicians having to make a new law.
Yeah, the miners are completely unwilling to do the Section 18 kind of pathway whatsoever. It's completely unpalatable. And then on the flip side, we're hearing that heritage is often used as a negotiating tool to actually get a higher royalty on the native title piece. So, yeah, it seems problematic from a permitting timelines, cost, efficiency perspective for the miners.
And a Section 10 can just arrive at any moment, even after you've done the full heritage assessment.
Well, the most interesting thing for me out of McPhillamys was this idea that you had two different groups of Indigenous people who had different views on heritage in the local area. And we saw the New South Wales government saying, this group over here, they are the people who have the right to say what is heritage and what's not. And the federal department took these people over here and their view of heritage. And Tanya Plibersek went to the Minerals Council conference in Canberra in September and said something really interesting. She stood up and basically said, we can't have this situation where we don't know who are the people with the right to speak for country. Effectively saying, we need to clear this up. We need to have a system where everybody knows and agrees on which Indigenous group are in charge effectively of heritage in that area. And she has a legislative reform, but guess what? That legislative reform has not even yet been introduced to the Parliament. We have an absolute maximum of 5 months left in the life of this Parliament, and increasingly people think we're going to have an early election, partly because the budget is starting to look a bit bad, and people now think, well, perhaps you wouldn't want to go to a budget in early May. announce a deficit and then go to the polls in late May, which was the default setting not so long ago. So people now start to wonder, does sort of April 13 start to become a viable date for an election, or late March? So plebiscite changes to clarify this aspect of Indigenous relations have very little chance of getting through Parliament. And, the polling suggests we're going to have a new Parliament, a new government after the next election. So it's probably not going to get resolved. It's probably going to continue being quite confusing.
How do you think the McPhillamys I know they talked about overturning it immediately, the Liberal government. Is it as simple as that if they did get elected?
I gather it is.
Yeah, right. That's interesting.
I don't gather that it's going to be too hard legislatively.
Yeah.
From a community perspective, I'm not sure. I haven't been up there to sort of take the temperature of it firsthand. But I don't think there's any huge barriers to them, pushing the button. And they would have a New South Wales Labor government cheering them on, which would help the political task.
Yeah, I think there was, and it's probably you reflect on. Was that probably the first big native title thing this year? That was definitely the biggest. But then I know the Bellevue one come not long after that, and it just felt like there was that bit of a roll on with precedent becoming a part of the, as you said, the leverage, to say, oh, they did it. We'll chuck in a Section 10 here.
I think I might be wrong, but I think the Bellevue one actually happened before.
Oh,
but wasn't widely sort of publicised,
Yeah.
and then what happened at McPhillamys sort of breathed life into this debate across the country. I might be wrong, but there was another article on it in the West today, actually, talking about Bellevue and the indefinite nature of it,
which is just obviously a section. I think it's the Southern Bell section. That
near the lake.
Yeah. So it's not the mine, it's but it is part of the future mine plan. Just to clarify.
On the political front, Pete, it also looks like an increasing proposition that the Senate will still be, a difficult thing to actually get legislation passed as well. So even if you have a change in government or a return of government, you might have, just more stalemate and actually, on the policy front to streamline some of these things, which are clearly impacting industry as well.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, a WA state election as well. So it sounds like, this WA Labor government who wanted, passionately 4 years ago to get rid of the Indigenous or the Aboriginal Heritage Act, I think it's called, of 1972. Around the time of Duke and Gorge, there was almost bipartisan support, across the industry and across government to do that. Of course, famously, it came in last year in 2023, repealed, 2 months later or something. And it sounds from this distance over here in Melbourne, it sounds like that's just disappeared as an issue in the WA state political arena. Is that right?
Well, remember, was the start of this year when the heritage things were going to come in, where pretty much every explorer, every farmer, had to get heritage surveys.
18 months ago.
I think that was around
July 1. It was going to be
the new financial year in 23.
Yeah, and then they backflipped on it, and that just hasn't been spoken about again.
I think it got kicked down the road a little bit, but I do think the government, the state government here, is under Roger Cook is just a lot more receptive to industry input. So there's less of a fear of its impact to industry.
Yep. So, maybe as a Basil's Empress on the show. What's Basil?
Oh God, I'm not sure. I think they'd be open to anything because they've got to win back 90% of the seats or something. Need the biggest swing in history. I know it'll take them a few elections to sort of get the swing back in their way, because it is that. What do they got? 4 seats or something? I don't know. They got bugger all seats.
I mean, going hand in hand with permitting is the environmental laws, which again were big talking points across the state and across the country. And I think the flashpoint was the massive write-down that South 32 did at Worsley. And, there was an implicit threat that this would cost, I think, 1,700 odd jobs, and, because they couldn't mine essentially what they wanted to mine. And just on Friday or perhaps Thursday last week, we saw a bit of a changing in the stance from the WA government, and South 32 will be able to mine what they wanted to sort of mine. And yeah, I remember just chatting with people at Diggers, and this was one of the biggest topics with investors and companies that kept coming up. And blowing out permitting just blows out the economics for these projects. And I'm not sure if we sort of find a middle ground. It does seem like the WA government, to their credit, has sort of seen that there needs to be a sort of business and environmental sort of middle ground that works for everyone. But that was a big talking point, I remember, at Diggers, and everyone was sort of, every second conversation it kind of came up. So I'm not sure how much of that you got over in Melbourne, Pete, but yeah.
There was a bit, it did register. And I think behind the scenes, the big thing that changed between, say, what was it, roughly May, when South 32 came out and said Worsley's, in trouble if things stay as the WA EPA proposes. And I think last week when basically Worsley got the green light, what really changed in that period was that the WA government referred emissions policy to the feds. And so I think South 32, there was many things in that approval at the start of the year that they didn't like, but 90% of it was about emissions.
Yeah.
And they felt like the WA government, through the EPA, were taking a more aggressive stance on carbon emissions than the federal safeguards mechanism policy was. And the argument was, can we just operate under the national scheme? And so it looks like that's what's going to happen now. The federal scheme's not entirely easy. It's, I think from memory, for most facilities, it's 43% reduction by 2030. Going down sort of in 4.9% to 5% increments per year. And some industries have had a bit of a softer run. I think the aluminium smelters and alumina refineries, pardon me, I think they get a less than 4% reduction per year.
And this is scope 1 and scope 2, right?
Correct.
Not including scope 3.
South 32's qualm, from my memory, was the inclusion of scope 3.
Yeah.
In that process.
Yeah. So it's interesting, isn't it? So you will often hear from miners. You go to somewhere like Diggers, and you'll hear miners talk about how it's just getting harder all the time because of emissions policy, because of nature positive, biodiversity, heritage. And I'm not here to say they're wrong, but I do think every now and then the industry needs to remember, and your audience should remember, that in the past few years, the mining industry and the farming industry got the new WA Heritage Act repealed. This year, they got Plebiscite's Nature Positive Bill smashed into bits, into 3 tranches, and a lot of the hardest stuff's going to go. We've seen things like this happen where a WA government sort of stance on emissions gets axed, and they can now operate under the federal thing. So I'm not saying that that any particular type is right or wrong, but I think the industry needs to remember that it is actually having some wins as well now and then. And, for the public reputation of the industry, I think has improved so much compared to, if I think about covering this sector sort of 2011, 2012, 2013, in a city like Melbourne, you'd go to the movies and the Minerals Council would have some ad on at the start and people would just basically boo. Like the reputation was so bad after the industry killed the mining tax and effectively killed the carbon tax. And that it's gradually been repaired a bit. Like, I don't think mining companies are ever going to get a ticker tape parade through, the inner north of Melbourne, but it has changed. And particularly with the electric vehicle kind of revolution, like I think even in places like this, people now accept that critical minerals, battery minerals, are sort of a positive thing directionally for the environment. And so I think the mining companies just need to remember not to cry, or be careful how much you complain and cry, because the mining industry is definitely getting some wins.
Yeah, that puts it in great perspective. And it's hard to often zoom out at the time when you're so engrossed in the story or one particular issue, see the direction in which the industry is kind of headed.
Curry, what did you think of the release of Get Wet's 2.5 million bladder this year?
Look, it was. I'm going to admit, I was surprised.
Yeah, oh no way. It was massive. It was massive. Like the size of the bladder was directly proportional to how big of news it was.
Big news in the industry. Big mate, like 2024 in review for Get Wet, like literally saturated the mining industry.
Good, the perfect word for that, Trav. I think they're going to change their company name from Get Wet just to Wet. Because they've taken the next step. They are just wet. They are staying wet, and they're just going to keep bloody as in on the website. They're going to keep this country moist.
Water has been one of those reoccurring themes in the industry, Matty. This year we've spoken about it all the time, and these guys are just solving problems for the industry, aren't they?
Oh, mate,
The most flexible solution you could have to solve the problem.
And they just do it all for you.
Are we putting a 3 million litre bladder out of the question? Are we going to see 3 million litres?
I wouldn't put anything out of the question with these guys.
I wouldn't be surprised if we see 3 million litres plus for a bladder and possibly 4-digit pumping rates. They're at 600 litres a second. Can we get to 1,000?
Christmas really did
Let's
come
make
early.
it happen.
I want to see that. Matty Hall, just make it happen. Make it happen.
Get wet.
Get wet. And great to have him back on board. It was a Christmas present to me.
Sure was.
Go get wet.
On the topic of emissions and the environment and these sorts of things, another theme that stood out to me was how Glencore, being the leading example, how they approached, their coal business. So they'd sort of flagged this last year, but it sort of came in this year. They bought the Elk Valley assets from Teck, and they put it forward saying to their shareholders, if you want, we'll split the business, coal and, base metals, essentially. And that was pretty quickly swept under the rug after a few meetings, I think, between Gary Nagle and big shareholders. I don't think there was too much debate when it actually came.
There was a vote, though. There was a vote. Yeah.
Yeah. And shareholders clearly wanted the business to remain intact. And, the rationale that they give, the capital coming in from the coal assets can fund the base metals, as well as a publicly listed company being much better pair of hands for all these met and thermal coal assets that they hold. And I'm sure you would have picked this up, Pete, from where you sit, but there's been a real change in the ESG narrative over the past 4 years, hasn't there?
Big time, so much. The view of coal has just changed so much and probably matured as well. I mean, the same thing. So you referenced Glencore keeping their coal and their big shareholders being happy to do that. But also just the sales processes for those Queensland coking coal mines have been so competitive. There's so many people in there wanting to buy these mines. And obviously met coal's a little bit easier to argue from an ESG perspective than thermal coal. But the hot contest for those assets showed you that plenty of people still think this is, an industry with growth in it and an industry that you can look investors in the eye and say, we think met coal's worth being in. The other thing on this topic that really strikes me is these past 2, 3, or probably 5 years, we've talked so much about critical minerals, right? And governments all around the world are telling us that stuff that we've hardly ever heard of before are critical. Bismuth is apparently critical. I don't know what bismuth does. Apologies to all the bismuth fans and your, in your audience. But
loads of them, mate.
all these other minerals that are really bespoke and off Broadway, and thermal coal was not on that list. But 2 years ago, when coal prices started going through the roof, electricity prices in New South Wales started going through the roof, what did a federal Labor government in partnership with a New South Wales Liberal government do? They stopped the New South Wales thermal coal exporters from exporting as much coal. They said, there is now a domestic reservation. You must keep this amount at home for the coal-fired power stations, and you must not sell it for more than $125 a tonne, which is basically BHP's unit cost at Mount Arthur. Now, you can talk till you're blue in the face about how bismuth and, rhenium are critical, but when a government steps in and says, sorry, you can't export that anymore, like actions speak louder than words, I reckon. So rightly or wrongly, we're at this stage in the energy transition where stuff like thermal coal is still totally critical to our economy, is still going to be for a long time. And and it just feels like the conversation's maturing a bit. I think, people are sort of accepting that a bit, that this is actually going to be gradual. And if you believe in the merit of getting to net zero by 2050, that's going to be a hard political task. You're going to have to keep the swinging voter who's not very engaged on board, and they're not going to stay on board if power prices become so painful they can't buy their kids' shoes, So it sort of comes back to that idea of a stable transition, and avoiding really bad, short-term outcomes in terms of power prices, which we're not entirely doing. We are still suffering a fair bit of that.
Mate, back on to Rio, sort of. ERA, Jabiluka, that was pretty big this year.
Sure was.
And still going, and still not, I guess, the final nail in the coffin isn't there yet because of the court cases. And I know they're going to proceed to compulsory acquisition, but then there's the election and everything and the timing, and whether, if there is a change of government, whether they'll intervene and it won't go into the national park. What is the update with Jabiluka? Because that was pretty fascinating.
It was. And so for your audience who aren't following it closely, Rio have just done a big equity raising of the company that owns Jabiluka, the company's Energy Resources of Australia. That equity raising is going to take them up to something like, I think, 98% or something, which is past the threshold point at which you can go to compulsory acquisition. So a lot of the minority shareholders who had sort of been a bit of a stone in Rio's shoe at Jabiluka will now be sort of exited out of the company, whether they like it or not. And that gives Rio complete control over that rehab process. I think the saga's pretty much cooked there. I'm not sure. Look, I haven't asked them for a month or two, but when we did put the question to the new government in the Northern Territory about, will you, resume mining at Jabiluka, the answer was not yes. It was some very nuanced, we will respect the traditional owners. My interaction with those traditional owners, which has sort of been ongoing for probably 12, 13 years now, have been up there several times, walked through the school they've got there, which teaches in the local dialect. It's fascinating. Like, there was posters of Cyril Rioli up on the wall, with Indigenous language, and you just saw this like different version of Australia. I don't think that traditional owner group are for moving. Like, you will hear people say, once one generation, departs this mortal coil and the younger ones take over, then there'll be a change of attitude about mining. If anything, the younger ones seem to be more fervently against it. And I remember walking through that school probably over a decade ago, and there were posters up on the wall about Jabiluka. So it's absolutely intrinsic. So I don't think they're going to change their mind. I think the traditional owners are always going to be opposed. And therefore, it's going to be a pretty brave government to give the green light to going in. So I think that will be buried for all of time, that deposit. In terms of, obviously, a big theme you guys have covered this year on your show is about the uranium revival. And you can see, can't you, where demand's going to go. One thing that
Didn't make any fucking money out of it this year. It all went down.
It's a long game.
Gen, which I didn't have. Bloody bastards.
Well, one of the things I wonder about, Matt, is supply, because uranium, there are, lots of mines that are just uranium mines, such as Cigar Lake or Langer Heinrich. But uranium is also a byproduct at lots of mines, and that's dangerous. You only have to look at the state of cobalt markets to know how dangerous it is to invest in a commodity that has a fair bit of its supply being a byproduct. And so, there are some gold mines in South Africa that produce uranium as a byproduct. Of course, Olympic Dam, famously here. If BHP ever solve that Rubik's Cube and get Olympic Dam expanded, like, a lot of uranium is going to come to the market, and it will be price agnostic. So even if the uranium market doesn't need that uranium, it's just going to come onto the market because BHP runs that mine for the copper. So that, I reckon, is just the big unanswerable for people in your audience who are investing in uranium. You've got to think about the price insensitive uranium supply that will come.
And I've heard with Olympic Dam, I've heard once, I don't know if it's true, I've heard it's not a linear relationship between uranium and tons. Like, say if they double production, I think uranium more than doubles from what I've heard.
I think you might be right. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's like, could be. It's I suppose what hasn't moved in uranium, like the spot price has gone down, but I guess the term price has gone up, but the sentiment there has definitely lifted, whether the underlying, the equities and the spot haven't really moved. I think there is a lot of sentiment there. But as you said, there's still undetermined about because you can't just listen to one side saying there's a structural supply deficit coming up, but there is another side, believe it or not.
So I mean, you mentioned sentiment. I mean, we are 4 or 5 months from a federal election where one of the major parties is going to the election promising to build 7 nuclear power stations on Australian soil.
Yeah.
Like, that is so far away from where we were even 5-6 years ago. So you're dead right about sentiment. And we can all see demand is going to go up.
Yeah. Anyway, we'll wait and see. Might have to dip my toe back in next year.
Well, I convinced you. Am I excited yet about your own?
Yeah. No, it's more whether it goes up or down. It's just it's exciting that, as you said, that's in the news for Australia. Like that, we're like, holy shit, we're actually talking about potentially having nuclear power plant builds in this country, which you'd never think of. But it's like, who the hell isn't talking? Which countries aren't talking about building nuclear power plants and never will? Like, there is not many around the world, because every majority are saying, nah, we're expanding nuclear or starting nuclear or tripling nuclear. So yeah, it's going to be, and the time it takes, it's going to leave us behind if we don't consider it soon. So going to be the year of energy is coming up, Curry.
Yeah, well, and I mean, think about that. So Peter Dutton's policy is to build 7, right, around the country, which creates this kind of binary thing, because obviously the price tag of building 7 out of the taxpayer's purse, remember, this is centralised taxpayer, this is not the free market, is going to be huge, and it lets his political opponents point to the price tag and say, well, that's huge and it's going to take a long time. But imagine a scenario where he just built 1. Like, if you built 1 near Port Augusta, Whyalla, BHP's already railing uranium, out and through that part of the world. BHP has big power needs and wants, to expand and build a 2-stage smelter up near Olympic Dam. They're going to have more power demand. P.S. Whyalla steel mill is next door, and every politician seems to want to throw taxpayers' dollars at saving that. P.S. They're going to build a big desal plant there in that Upper Spencer Gulf region to provide the water to BHP, because BHP's dragging the Great Artesian Basin down, and traditional owners are getting upset that their bubbling springs aren't bubbling anymore. Imagine if they just proposed 1 there. Like, you could mount a pretty good case for it, couldn't you?
Yeah, well, I've got it, but I suppose they'd still have to, I suppose if BHP chucked a conversion and an enrichment facility in, full turnkey solution, but like, because you'd still, it's just so many steps to bloody get it. But it was funny, I actually went to a mine site in South Australia the other week, and it was the first one ever, actually. Yeah. But the way, after talking to people on site, and the regulator was actually on site on the day, and seeing how the regulator was engaging with the people on site, and the way they speak about the regulators, they're like a business partner. They're not a spy, or they're not. South Australia, it seems like it is such a mining-friendly jurisdiction. Like, after being there and seeing, because I've just been focused in WA, like, that is not to be underestimated. I think we posed the question earlier this year, like, what jurisdiction would you pick in Australia to mine in? It's fucking South Australia by a mile.
I think that's right. And on uranium in particular, like, I remember going to a mining conference in Adelaide. It would have been probably March 2012. So it was like 1 year after Fukushima. We were all like writing our 1 year on type stories at the time. And the SA Resources Minister at the time, Tom Coutens, I'm going to bugger up his name, Tom Coutens, Tom.
Tom
anyway,
yeah.
He stood up at this summit and said, we should be enriching uranium here at home, making nuclear power. So so that tells you something. Like 1 year after Fukushima, when nuclear power could not have been more unfashionable, elected officials from SA were still standing up saying we should have local nuclear power.
How about just the mining of uranium around Australia, Pete? Do you see that changing anytime soon?
I don't know. It doesn't feel like there's much progress in WA on that, right? Like I gather Mulga Rock and Uliri are sort of still
Not
missing in
Mulga
action.
Rock can be mined.
Can it?
Yeah. That got they dug a bit of a hole and they were that was classed as construction. So Mulga Rock can actually be mined, but whether that happens or not. But the rest of them.
That aside, it doesn't feel like a big ticket item for.
Nah.
for
Well, probably
WA
the
government.
better question to you: what is perceived as a bigger issue, probably over east and nationally, nuclear power or uranium mining in Australia?
Nuclear power by a mile.
Yeah. So would you think that if this nuclear power thing goes ahead, then uranium mining should flow through naturally?
It should certainly lose any remaining stigma, you would have thought, wouldn't you? You would have thought that having nuclear power stations on home soil is a bigger, bolder step to take than just having a uranium mine, particularly given we've had lots of uranium mines for a long time. So, yeah, I would have thought that the challenges in getting them up from a permitting perspective and a social perspective would dissipate.
Pete, on the topic of BHP, how do you think they sort of fared 2024? Like, how do you evaluate their year given the sort of botched attempt to acquire Anglo, the walking it back and then sort of not really doing much from a deal front sort of subsequent to that?
And buying Fila.
Buying
Yeah,
Fila, sorry, I forgot that. Yeah.
I didn't mind Philo, and I was surprised that they didn't participate in the NGEX raising. I don't know if you noticed, but for people who haven't followed it, NGEX is a little explorer that is exceptionally close to this Philo deposit, which BHP bought into for about $3 billion US, $4 billion US back in, what was that, August, I think. And NGEX has many common shareholders to Philo, the Lundin family, and so forth. So I was surprised they didn't fold that in. I gather that they left that out just because they felt like it would just complicate the transaction a little. It would be another shareholder vote that would have to go through and just create another avenue for someone to try and get in the way and block it. So I think we can all expect relatively confidently that NGEX, a Toronto-listed company, will eventually sort of fold into that what do they call it? Vicuna province, I think they call it.
Well, it was all spun out, and then it's going to be spun back in effectively.
Yeah, but I did find that telling. I did find. Sorry, Trav.
I was going to say I actually don't think it would have made sense for them to tip into that race because, like, NGX's deposit needs a lot more drilling out. It's a veiny system as opposed to Filo del Sol, and so like eventually the JV will acquire it. But for BHP, there is no need to do that deal for 10, maybe even 15 years. So you may as well like have that drilling done by someone else's money, and then weigh up whatever the valuation of NGX is in due course. Maybe the deal probably gets done in 5 years, but you don't have to put your capital towards that process. You can let other people put their capital towards that. It's
like Encounter WA1, very similar. Like it's there, but you don't need it yet. Yeah.
No, it's a really good point, Trav. And I think the fact that BHP saw also just some awkwardness in the process of tying an extra company into that with an extra shareholder vote told me that they had learned some lessons out of Anglo. I mean, Anglo was a surprisingly complex, ambitious task. The idea, we're going to buy something and then we're going to spit that bit out over there. I'm going to spit this out over there and we might try and sell this bit. There is a school of thought that some hold inside BHP that they sort of stuffed up the external relations on that, particularly on the South African side. To be fair to them, if you recall, the deal got leaked almost certainly via the Anglo-American side. So perhaps that was just smart PR by Anglo. Perhaps Anglo knew that if word got out in the middle of a South African election, that sort of national champion fervor protectionist type thing would flare up. So, to some degree, we have to be fair to BHP and say they probably didn't plan to launch this during a South African election. It just got launched on them. But look, it feels like both Anglo and BHP are moving in the same direction. So Anglo's now stripping out all this complexity. They're getting rid of a lot of the things that BHP wouldn't want. So that's going to make it, when BHP, as I expect, eventually come back again, they will have a simpler target, a simpler proposition. The overall dollar figure will be lower, which makes it easier. But if you're an Anglo shareholder, perhaps the valuation on the copper assets will be higher, because they will, like these companies like Antofagasta, whose, copper just stands sort of on its own. Maybe Anglo can get to a point, get their copper valued at a higher point, and when BHP comes in, it sort of looks like this path we're on right now sort of works for both camps a bit.
Ding, ding, ding for Anglo, by the way. How do you think that, like, BHP proposed the deal, said, if you do all this, we will take you over, and now they've knocked it back, but they're trying to do all that. But does then that make them obviously a bit more palatable for someone else, or do you think no one else will have a go? It'll just be BHP looking at them.
Lots of other people would like to work with Anglo, and I think you guys highlighted on your show the fact that Anglo is in talks with some of its neighbours. Maybe it's Glencore and someone else up at Quebrada Blanca, I think, about putting several mines together into a sort of partnership model. So lots of others would be interested, but I think BHP being out there with a stated sort of foot in the water, that scares off a lot of people, right? Like a lot of people will say, do we really need a bidding war with BHP when Ivanhoe is still sitting out there, waiting for someone? And I think we saw that with Oz Minerals, right? Like, plenty of people would have liked Oz Minerals. No one came in with another bid.
And what was that? Was that 6-9 months between the first and the second bid?
It's about 6-ish.
Yeah.
And in the case of Glencore, like, I think they might be, excited about things that might be spun out of that potential, BHP Anglo deal. Like, if they can get iron ore exposure from Minas Rio, which could get spun out of Anglo, that's a pretty big win for Glencore, and who else is going to buy that? So
yeah.
Well, and speaking of the issue of like things getting spat out of a BHP Anglo merger, don't forget South 32, right? So they've got Sierra Gorda copper mine in Chile, which is like 5 k's from BHP's Spence copper operation, and those two assets are moving closer together. Like the resource at Sierra Gorda is taking them towards Spence, so those two mines definitely belong together. Sierra Gorda is closer to Spence than any of the existing BHP portfolio. It's no coincidence that in November, that when all the analyst community went over to do the big BHP Chilean copper tour, that South 32 had the analysts to their mine on the Thursday after the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday.
South 32 is non-operator there, though. They'd want to get operatorship of Sierra Gorda first from KGHM.
Yeah, the Polish group would have a say in this, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
And I think even, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think possibly even the capex that BHP needs to spend at Spence is about, I think the bottleneck might be at the mill or the processing plant, whereas at Sierra Gorda it's the opposite.
You know more than me.
Correct. Yeah, I gather that's the case. So those two go together. And also BHP has this Cerro Colorado mine, right, which is sort of idled at the moment. And if you look in their slide pack, it's going to be like $3 billion US of capex to restart it. So this thing's got 2 billion tons of copper resource, which when you're pitching to North American investors who aren't particularly savvy about mining, they love, it's got 2 billion tons of resources. Great. They tend to think less about whether it's profitable, as you can see it here.
As Tommy Warwick said, contained copper. It's all about contained copper.
But like if you're BHP, the central narrative out of that big BHP investor tour to Chile in November was, we need to spend somewhere between 10 billion US and 14 billion US to keep our production level steady like to avoid a drop off. There was they were promising a bit of growth, but really it was not much. And Cerro Colorado was like $3 billion US of that. So that strikes me as the sort of thing you're going to be looking for things to cut off your CapEx bill. Sell Cerro Colorado to someone, make a bit of cash in the door, cut $3 billion off your CapEx bill, and that perhaps allows you to spend the billions at Olympic Dam to do the 2-stage smelter.
What expansion would they do at Olympic Dam that you speak of? Is that when the big pit they were talking about, or like?
No, the big open pit's not coming back, unfortunately. Wouldn't that be fun? No, it's so the cap. I think it's slated for roughly 2027. Does not yet have FID, but is sort of notionally going to come at that time. And it's the construction of a 2-stage smelter, which you obviously know more about metallurgy than me, but I gather it's about the sulfur content, about either the ore is either going to have too much sulfur in future or not enough. That either way, this smelter will better balance the sulfur.
And that's their SA Copper 500, target kind of thing.
That's right. And I gather that this also comes as they feed in ore sources from the old Oz Minerals mines, so Prominent Hill and Carapatina. I think it helps them with, to integrate them well.
Yeah, and I think and another thing with those, I think when the Oz Minerals ones were by themselves, this is probably back to the initial rationale, they had to isolate the higher uranium areas because they were just going for the copper. They couldn't really touch them, but now it can all be sort of blended in because BHP like uranium now, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the big winners of the Pete were the gold miners who, finally got back in vogue as gold price sort of rallied to all-time highs. And, we've seen some pretty big, chunky deals amongst the ASX miners for recently the Northern Star acquiring De Grey, Greatland picking up Telfer. Yeah, Red 5, Silver Lake merger. Like, how have you evaluated the gold space in 2025?
I would, in some ways, I'd bow to you guys. You guys definitely know more about that gold space than me, particularly being closer to it over in WA.
Thank you, Peter.
I guess, and I should extend that to every commodity, probably. So the part of the gold sector that I've probably observed more has been Newmont. I think it was October of 2023, so we're just past a year since Newmont closed the Newcrest deal, and gold prices have gone up, right? So you would have thought that takeover's looking even better, but it doesn't feel like Newmont shareholders are very happy.
They're not happy at all. They feel like they've been, they've bought it done.
Yeah. And Lihir is doing what it always does, sound big and great, but some autoclave has a problem, or the rocks are too hot for humans to be underground, or something like that. One thing that should happen there at Lihir is that gets combined with St Barbara's Simberi. I gather, as you probably know, at Simberi, there's the mine needs to move from an oxide to a sulfide, I gather, or maybe the other way around. And St Barbara will have to spend hundreds of millions to build processing that can handle that. Whereas if you stick it on a barge and, float it 5 minutes that way, you take it to Lihir, where there is processing equipment that can handle that. Or I gather those two parties, the owners of those two assets, have talked for a long time. Back in the Newcrest St Barbara days, there were offers made, and the gap was always just too big. But there's a big prize here for Newcrest, for Newmont, I should say, the owner of Lihir, which is the delaying of CapEx. At some point, Lihir has huge CapEx where they have to build a big seawall to keep the water out and move, because they're really working in a phone box there right on the shoreline. So if you can do a deal with Simberi, you buy a few years of, shipping that material over, you delay that sort of big CapEx. So that's another deal that should probably happen soon. But do you guys reckon that Northern Star will have any competition?
No.
Up at De Grey?
Unlikely.
Too big of a deal. It'd have to be an international. that'd do it. And
There's literally just a couple of them as well, right?
yeah.
Newmont's not
And
gonna do
what's
it.
the deal valued at now? It's obviously not $5 billion now because Northern Star's share price is down. Probably bloody 4.5 or something. Don't know.
And Barrick probably won't be able to move because their CEO will be in jail in Mali.
Yeah, jeez.
Oh, but you couldn't see Barrick re-entering Australia, I wouldn't think.
No, wouldn't have thought.
And yeah, I don't. Yeah, I'm more interested to see with that De Grey thing, just because it's so transformational for Northern Star. Like different, like just it's an undeveloped refractory. It's not semi-refractory like Kalgoorlie. It's undeveloped refractory, and it's greenfields. Like it's so different to what their strategy has been. That's sort of built the company to date. And I'm just going to be very interested in the future. What's behind the hood there? That obviously they've uncovered in the DD, which has been their reason that this is the best option for them. So I'm just because they're obviously a lean, intelligent team. Northern Star, they're not like a big bureaucratic organisation like a huge multinational gold miner. So they must be so confident on this being the right play for them. So, I'm very, very interested in it. So,
I think there's two other parts of the gold market that really intrigued me this year. The first one is that, in my view, the goldies didn't move commensurate with the gold price improvement that we saw. And central banks are keen to gobble up gold and chuck it in their reserves. And, international institutions weren't keen to buy gold miners necessarily. That money did not flow through to the same degree that, the free cash flow benefits would have actually followed through, year on year for the gold miners. And the other one's a bit of a smaller point, but Newmont's a great example. You mentioned it, Pete. The way they got smashed when they had poor earnings, I think it would have been the Q3 calendar year earnings. Like they're down over 30%. On the day, I think they were down 15% and they were a
it's huge, eh?
$60 or $70 billion US company, and that just goes to show the extent that quants and the pod shops, kind of run the market. And when you don't pass the test, you don't meet the grade, you really get smashed. And people realize, hey, you're not making anywhere near enough money. You're not delivering on these promises, and they got really punished for it. That really stood out to me. Like they're big, that's a $10 billion sort of plus move. It's kind of fascinating to see.
Well, and we saw we've seen a few days like that where there's been huge moves, haven't we? Like, remember the day that Yancoal suspended the dividend because they were looking at deals? Like it was 20% or something?
Yeah.
And a couple of weeks ago, Iluka, like I think it's safe to say management at Iluka were, didn't expect that sort of share price decline.
Oh, come on. They must have expected that. They put out a deck that didn't show project IRR, it showed equity IRR. Like, come on. They knew it was a doozy.
I'm not sure that scale because it was more than 10%. And briefly, there was that brief moment for like half an hour that day when Iluka's market cap fell below Deterra's, which reminded me of the days when we used to get excited because Sandfire's market cap had gone above Oz Minerals while Oz Minerals was still owning the 20% stake. And like at the moment as well, like bauxite price above iron ore on certain metrics.
Crazy.
Well, with that, Trav, you'd be more in the weeds with this as a Yancoal ding, ding, ding.
Ding, ding, ding.
Are they're still being priced as if they're going to allocate capital to something?
They've made up the gains from when they paused the divvy.
They're still below $7, but
they are, and I think like they haven't announced doing a special dividend. Like shareholders want a special dividend. They are almost certainly looking at buying Kestrel. I think shareholders they'd be happy for them to not buy it and just declare a special dividend. But
who do you reckon's going to buy it if they don't?
Kestrel.
Yeah.
I think the odds-on favourite to buy any kind of coal divestment is just M Resources in consortium with Stanmore or whatever. Like they're hyperactive, funding backed via Wijaya family in Indonesia as well.
Yeah.
Fascinating how Indonesia has made this big move on Australian coal in the last decade, right? So you mentioned the Wijaya family backing Stanmore, but we've also seen Anthony Salim, who has lots of business interests, including
Sexy
making
Rexy.
noodles.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's in Mac, and yes, bought Rex as well. And of course, Boomer, I can't remember what Boomer stands for, but BUMA, the mining services firm, coming into the recent Peabody deal.
Yeah.
So, Indonesia, one of the world's biggest coal exporters, for some reason, is coming south, to get into Australian coal.
Yeah. And Matt Lattimore, in a lot of ways, this kind of unknown figure who is, clearly established himself as the coal tycoon of this cycle. But not many people. We don't know him, But
Mate, bring back Tinkler. Get him back. He'd be good. He's good for the media. What Curry? Best story you broke this year? Did you break any? What were you first to market on? What excited you the most? Or you just bloody you're just doing me, copy and pasting someone else's.
Yeah, exactly. I'll wait for that Money of Mine newsletter to come out.
You don't give yourself enough credit there, mate, because we're stealing it off you.
Most of it's just coming from you, Pete.
If I may take the question on a slight deflection, so I have twins who are 6 years old, and every night I sort of give them a bedtime story. And the one that we've read the most this year has a bit of a link to the Iluka Eneabba situation in my mind, because it's called Thelma the Unicorn. I don't know if any of you've read it before, but the premise of Thelma the Unicorn is that Thelma is like this plain, dumpy horse, grey horse in a paddock who has low self-esteem. And one day, through a series of slapstick events, Thelma gets coated in pink paint and some glitter, and a carrot lands on her head like that. And suddenly people go, "You look like a unicorn. This is incredible." And Thelma's like, "I've always wanted to be a unicorn. This is exciting." And Thelma proceeds to lead this rock star lifestyle, right? Like she's now, walking down the street, people are taking photos, paparazzi, they're following her, screaming, shouting, much like I gather Matt Michael when he walks down Hay Street. But so anyway, this goes on, but gradually Thelma starts to see the downside of fame. And she starts to realize, people are being mean about me. But is this, and I miss my friend Otis, the donkey who Thelma shared the paddock with. And by the end of the book, Thelma decides to wash the pink paint off, wash the sparkles, take the carrot off, and just go back to being a sort of a grey horse in the paddock. And so you can probably work out the analogy I'm painting here is that a few years ago, Iluka, a relatively off-Broadway mineral sands producer, decided to go the rock star route and become a rare earths play at the time, where rare earths is the rock star end of the mining industry. You get to go have dinner at the White House if you're in rare earths. Let's be honest. So I do wonder if, and I watched your analysis of it a couple of weeks ago, which was very in depth. I do wonder if Iluka's story in rare earths will be similar to Thelma's journey as a unicorn. But I also think when we think about that refinery, it's really important to separate what's good for Iluka. Is it good for Iluka or is it good for the government? And we have to remember, and you talked about it, how generous that debt was from the former Morrison government, non-recourse and low interest rates and all that sort of stuff. So even though you made some really good points there about, it complicating the investment proposition, is this a mineral sands producer with a bit of rare earths and an iron ore royalty tacked in together? They still were kind of looking a gift horse in the mouth, weren't they, when the government came with that big cheap debt package? So I wonder if it's more dodgy for taxpayers than it is perhaps for Iluka.
Yeah.
So, what do you think? Do you disagree strongly?
Yeah, I think the taxpayers will this amendment to the loan's not going to be the only one, in my opinion. There'll be cost blowouts, and then interim working capital needs, and yeah, I mean, you're going to require consistent concessions from the financier in order to kind of fund through that if this thing goes full steam ahead, in my opinion. So I don't think you should understate the amount of capex Iluka has to fork out from their own side of things too, because one thing that's kind of hidden away is they plan to bring online Wimmera, which is in Victoria. Wimmera you can sell some product from there, but they still require a purification solution in order to sell a zircon product from that, which is like, it is high grade zircon. If you can't figure out a way to do that, then the economics are questionable unless you are selling the rare earth concentrate to Eneabba. But the capex at Wimmera, this is a PFS-ish level a few years ago, so it was like 775 million. It's called it about $1 billion today. So it's not going to be and that's going to have to be funded from Iluka's own balance sheet. And if the only avenue for that product is the refinery, then, you know, all I'm saying is Iluka are going to have to spend a fair bit of their own money here too. But the big question mark is on the taxpayer.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Like, the resources industry is a risk-on industry. And when I think about, like, so I've reported on it for 13 years now. Over that period, the people who have been willing to take the most risk have tended to win. I mean, Andrew Forrest is the prime example of that. And with MinRes, if you put aside the governance stuff, before that broke, we were all sort of fascinated by MinRes just from a balance sheet perspective. And that's still really tight, and they're not out of the woods, and there's still huge question marks. But, by selling the gas and selling the stake in the Hall Road, they've managed to sort of calm that a little bit. And that's one thing I think about with Iluka, actually. I kind of wonder, they could have played it safe, but is that what the resources industry is for? It seems to be a place for wild risk taking. Yeah, we'll watch it with interest.
I think, and probably further to your comments about Australian downstream, like, that is even more risk on, because Australia will never have the scale to be influential globally in downstream. Like, you got to pick look at nickel, like Indonesia took over. Rare earths, like, if the money keeps going into rare earths downstream, it's like, it's a bet that rare earths are going to take off. But like, Australia's never going to influence it enough. Lithium, like, look at what's happened in lithium downstream. It's like, if we go downstream, we're always going to struggle because we're never going to move the needle and take over the world with it. So it's always going to have to come from the workers, maybe.
And the downstream is low margin business as well. So, when it's low margin and you don't do it right, your margin's gone.
Yeah.
So.
And geopolitics is a lot of the rationale for why the government's putting this money in. But if you actually think about geopolitics, who are our really close defence partners now? Obviously the US, but it's Japan and South Korea. They are two nations that have built their economies on downstream, right, on processing. And there have been people in South Korea in particular who have looked at Australia talking about, we're going to start making batteries and semiconductors in Australia, and said, hang on a minute, like, under our friendship, isn't that our bit? Like, you want to do the mining and that bit. Well, then what's in this friendship for us? So I think we also need to be mindful of those sorts of unintended consequences that you might piss off a South Korea or a Japan or someone if you try and eat their lunch.
What I like your Lahir Simberi prediction there. Never even thought of that. Kudos to you, Mr. Kerr. Any other?
Travis,
have you mentioned that before?
I actually don't think so. I was taking notes then.
Ripper. Yeah. Bloody Curry. That's why we love you, mate. Mate, is there any other out there left field deals? Like, obviously we don't, BHP Anglo ain't left field. Any other little interesting ones, 2025 predictions, whether it's tie-ups, divestments, or anything that maybe we haven't talked about, or you mightn't want to give away your secret sauce here?
Well, so Cobar obviously is going to be a scene of consolidation, most likely, and I know you guys did an episode on that, so your viewers can go back and watch that. Insert type code here. But it's interesting, isn't it? Like, we can sit here in an air-conditioned office in Melbourne and look at a map and say, it makes lots of sense for that company to match with that company. But when you talk to the people out on the ground there's often some quite surprising impediments, like, if that company is going to match with that company, the material would have to be driven on a truck through the main street of town, and that's not going to be okay. So you therefore have to build a new road around the outskirts of town. And is it going to be a bitumen road or a dirt road, or is there enough water there between here and there? So it's easy for us to say. But yeah, it looks like Cobar, there's some deals that can be done there, you would have thought. Interesting to watch what's happening up in those PNG islands with Geo-Pacific and their close neighbour Kingston at Misima.
Oh, both have a common large shareholder in Delphi.
Yeah, that's right. So, and both are sort of in various stages of processes. There's a formal process now for Misima, whereas Geo-Pacific are in this rather interesting, to say the least, fundraising process. What else? Who else is going to do a deal? We mentioned Sierra Gorda and Spence. It probably may not be next year, but that's got to happen sometime soon. I do wonder, thinking longer term, if some of those coal miners, the ASX-listed coal miners, make sense to come together. So out of that batch of Yancoal, between Yancoal, Stanmore, New Hope, there might be someone else I'm forgetting. You have relatively
even Peabody's listed over there, but going to end up with a big Australian portfolio now. Could easily merge with a Whitehaven down the track.
Yes, and those first three have registers that are still quite bulky, like a small number own big shares, which makes them illiquid. I mean, that's part of the reason Yancoal has sort of traded below its notional value for a long time, is because so much of it's locked up by sort of big Chinese instos. So if you put two companies together with really clogged up registers, you end up with a register that's a bit clogged up but not quite as clogged up. I know you guys, Trav and Jonas, have worked in that sort of corporate finance end. Would that make sense from an M&A perspective, like putting two companies together almost just to like make a more liquid register?
I think like the impediment on Yancoal for a long time was the fact that it didn't have enough free float to be in the ASX 200. It actually is now. It's in the 200. So it got there by virtue of these sell downs of Cinder Group, which were the second largest shareholder. Any deal that Yancoal do, like any merger of one of those companies you listed, would require FIRB approval by virtue of the fact that these Chinese entities are, and I see that as the big unknown at the moment. I don't think we're going to have any kind of view on how FIRB's going to react to Chinese investments in Australia for minerals projects until the next government, because like we've seen a lot of FIRB decisions of that nature just kind of be kicked down. The can's been kicked down the road like month after month after month. In general, I think there'd be like a political apprehension to have like potentially more Australian assets kind of land banked by Chinese control, for lack of a better word. So I don't know if it'd be palatable for Chinese entities to emerge, kind of call it a 40% shareholder of the pro forma. You get enough control to really influence things that way.
Yeah.
But the rest kind of, I could see a world where New Hope merged with Stanmore. Like I wouldn't say that's a non-zero. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, agree with that point. And I think there's, certain assets as well where it makes sense. I'd have to dust off the map again, like you kind of speak of, but there's definitely a few in the Bowen Basin that would have some sort of synergies which the companies would be looking at in light of royalties and these things, inflation as well, jacking up the costs to make themselves a bit more competitive again. I definitely think that'd be a worthwhile sort of look at. And I also think just more broadly, a lot of those mines have gone more and more underground as the years have gone on. So there's, the risk of disruption is steadily growing. I think we saw it with Grosvenor this year with the fires there, and I think that's a little something to keep an eye on too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder what's going to happen with Chalice, right? So hasn't that been a fall from grace? We saw a few years ago Sibanye-Stillwater come into Australia and set up a little Australian presence through New Century Zinc, the old zinc mine up there, and I think that means they possibly also have the old Mount Lyell copper asset in Tassie, which is sort of So I got the vibe at the time that Sibanye were coming here and wanted to be a player. They wanted us to know they were here and they were coming. I think they do quite a lot of PGEs in Africa. So I wonder if they saw Chalice as their next thing.
Sibanye had a big fall from grace, like just big distressed balance sheet. PGM prices came under pressure, but a lot of Sibanye's like capital allocation was like quite frankly like disastrous. They bought a bunch of stuff, a bunch of stakes in things which were just like very, very dubious, including New Century, by the way, which has been a disaster for them. But they're still in recovery mode on their own balance. They can't do any deals for a while. Is how I.
And speaking of Chalice, I haven't checked the palladium price yet. Has it got to $2,000?
It's about halfway there. Got a bit of a way to go. Yeah, the Platts and palladium market is still a bear market. And yeah, on the topic of Sibanye as well, they had to sort of put some of their US ops on care and maintenance in part, pullback plans, pullback capex in South Africa. But that's an interesting market to sort of follow. Again, geopolitics so much concentrated in South Africa with the other dominant player being Russia. So that's a super interesting market, as well as tying in a few themes here together. The EV sort of transition, whether hybrids play that bigger role, and the demand for autocatalytic converters grows from very low expectations. From a sort of low expectation of growth. I think that's one to follow, and very limited ways, Chalice being one of them, to kind of look at that lens or play that lens on the ASX.
Yeah. This is a slight deviation from mining, but I know your audience loves the sort of counter-cyclical kind of, bet. So with hydrogen, which we've talked about a lot the past few years, the hydrogen market is if you think lithium's having a hard time right now, go have a look at the listed hydrogen stocks, like the Norwegian company Nel ASA, and then there's a couple of slightly less credible US listed hydrogen vehicle aspirants like Nikola Motors and Hyzon, and many others. They are, almost all of them are down 95, 96, 97%. And I often think about Fortescue in this context. In a company like Nel, the Norwegian company, that is an established incumbent electrolyzer manufacturer. They're not like a spivvy startup. Like, they make them and sell them to people today. Their valuation is down so much. If you're a company like Fortescue who still, despite walking back a bit from your goals, is saying, we still think hydrogen's a big thing and we want to be in hydrogen, why aren't they going and buying Nel? And instantly getting hold of, 10% of the world's electrolyzer manufacturing supply chain. So I look at companies like that and think, if hydrogen is going to be a big thing in the future, right now Nel is just like a screaming buy. I'm not saying it is a buy. I'm saying that if hydrogen is going to be big,
the big point is if, right? And heck, who knows what Fortescue would do there? And I don't know enough about Nel, but to the point on if hydrogen's going to be a big thing, and you framed this kind of piece by saying we like counter-cyclical things. Well, I would argue that hydrogen never had a bull market, because hydrogen always had to prove itself, and the reality is the laws of thermodynamics dictated that it is not going to be a cost-competitive form of energy. Like, maybe very bespoke applications, but it's just like, let's get real. Like,
all froth and no cappuccino, you reckon?
Yeah. Yeah, you need crazy high, you need crazy high, gas prices for it to be a realistic kind of substitute, which we don't want. That's bad for everyone.
I reckon let's wrap this one up, Pete, with a couple quick-fire predictions for 2025. So, first three I put together. What will the iron ore, lithium, and gold price be in 1 year's time?
Oh, no pressure.
Iron ore will be 91 US, because there does seem to be a fair bit of credibility in this idea that it's hard for it to go below 80 US. By this time next year, there might be a bit of sim and do in the market, but not much. So above 80 probably. So let's say 91. What was the next one? Lithium?
Yeah, let's go lithium.
Spodumene. Oh, cover your ears now, Tony Ottaviano. 800 US a ton. Let's hope it's 1,500, but 800. And the third one, gold.
Yeah, let's go. Gold.
Well, I went to a Melbourne Mining Club lunch in about 2012 where the then CEO of Newcrest, Greg Robinson, I think he felt like he didn't have anything too interesting to say. So I think they just injected his speech with a wild gold price forecast. And I think he said gold's going to be $5,000 an ounce by 2030.
Still waiting.
Correct. So I'm getting on the Greg Robinson train, $5,000 an ounce.
What about the exchange rate, Aussie US dollar? Because that has a big effect on these prices.
Slightly outside my skill set. Let's say, well, I guess if iron ore is going down, then we're probably weakening, aren't we? So let's say 62.
Will BHP have another bite at Anglo in the next year?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes, I think so. Yeah, look, the end of your question is probably the only uncertainty, isn't it? Will it be next year, or will they wait longer? But look, they've looked like a place that is a bit impatient, and I don't say that as a criticism. But Mike Henry and Ken McKenzie are not going to die wondering. They've made that abundantly clear these past few years. Like when Mike came in, many people sort of thought he would be this sort of, relatively boring, sort of data obsessed kind of guy. Like he's a man of action, right? The stuff he's done in that company, it's been huge. So yeah, you have to assume that these two have another crack before they call it stumps, which on the default setting is sort of this time next year for Ken.
Any others, gents?
What's the big theme that we reflect back on in 12 months' time?
Maybe the AFR takeover bid for Money of Life.
I can't wait to analyse a deal of it ourselves.
It's coming a bit low.
Yeah. Oh, look, travel up the merger ratio. Fucking thing. I'll be like.
I don't know. Look, one thing that is a bit of it, particularly, I gather your studio's in West Perth. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
For the good denizens of, Havelock Street and Hay Street, the JMEI, the Junior Minerals Exploration Incentive, is this federal program that's existed for about a decade now, and it's pretty small, so doesn't get a lot of attention. I think it might be worth something like, 25 mil or 30 mil a year in cost to the Australian taxpayer. And it allows people who buy shares in greenfield exploration companies to obtain a tax credit. I gather it's a little bit similar to sort of like a dividend, franking sort of credit type thing. So that long-held policy is only promised up to June 30 next year. So it will be interesting to see if that gets extended because, it's been a pretty good 5 years for explorers, right? And I know we're coming into a hard period, so perhaps that will be the industry's sell to Canberra, which is, all the data shows that cash inflows to the exploration sector are still pretty good, but starting to decline. But yeah, they're going to have to make their case because if the budget's heading into deficit, government's going to be, pardon me, looking for every dollar they can save. So, yeah, so maybe West Perth needs to fire up on the JMEI.
Yeah, I think a good old AMEC are working hard on that one. Should we talk about synergies between Money and Mine? Have you got an office over here? No. Now that Brad Thompson's bloody, that could be part of the deal. We're only doing it if Brad Thompson comes back. There you go,
Brad's
Brad.
having trouble. Brad is having trouble with his hives at the moment. I know you and many other people in the WA resources industry will be devastated to hear that there's a bit of a problem with the bees and the supply.
It was a disease it was like a bee pandemic. It was bloody when he was explaining. It's fucking it's catastrophic. I'm being very serious when I'm saying this. It was bloody. Yeah, tough to be in the beehive industry at the moment, by the sounds. So,
jars of Brad Thompson's honey is the must-have item in the pantry of every powerful, influential person in Western Australia. So,
yeah, we had to declare that honey because it was like a gift from an organisation. We didn't want to think we were being bought by that honey. So, no, mate. That's bloody sensational.
Before we go, can I hijack your?
I've got a random one for you actually. I've got my own idea here. It's out there. Do you think Bellevue Gold will be acquired, and by who? If so, do you think that they will have to be acquired, merged, or take someone over to take the focus off their one operation?
I had not thought that. I'm willing to be convinced of that. What about this for a crazy idea that I've literally spent 1 second thinking about? Aren't they quite geographically close to Liontown?
Yes.
Yep.
Would you put Liontown and a gold miner like Bellevue together?
No.
And have the down and the up, have the protection, and swing to the fences and play a straight bat when you need to.
Possible,
mate. That's why Glencore is one of my favourite companies, because they get it. You just have your coal and your copper and happy days.
Well, that's because my out there one is. Would it make sense that Develop and Bellevue come together?
That's out there.
That is an out there 2025 prediction for me. That'd solve a lot of problems on both sides. Already there.
A great idea. Develop is one of the really interesting things to happen in the sector in the past few years, isn't it? And probably doesn't get as much attention as it could do, given Bill's such a big character. Can I completely hijack your show for 5 minutes? Because
absolutely.
Mate, we can even put it at the front if you want.
Well, I've been thinking of ways that I can completely shred any remaining credibility that I've got. And
well, you came on Money of Mine, so that's a good thing.
Yeah. And I've had this recurring thing for years, right? And there's not really much of an avenue for me. There's not an outlet for me to do this at the Fin Review. So maybe your audience will enjoy it. And it's this nagging feeling I've got that every time I listen to a mining prezzo, it's that mining industry jargon makes great names for rock bands. Have you ever noticed that? So like you remember on David Letterman on The Late Show, he used to have like tonight's top five reasons why Puff Daddy should host the Oscars or whatever.
Yeah.
I've come up with a top 5 mining industry jargon that sounds like great names for rock bands.
I'm here for it.
Let's hear them.
This is going straight on LinkedIn.
All right. And what I need, your part in this, I'm willing to shred my credibility over this, but I just need the crowd, the audience, to come along. Like, wave a cigarette lighter if you want.
It can be the canned laughter like Letterman.
Yeah, exactly. So we're going to start, right? Think mid-'80s stadium rock, okay? You're at Wembley Stadium. It's packed. You've just listened to Electric Light Orchestra or, I don't know, some band, Def Leppard. And, okay, you ready? The next band, welcome to the stage, Electric Arc Furnace.
Yes.
Is that the best name for a rock band in history?
That's great. That is great.
I thought decarbonisation of steel could be like so musical.
Brilliant.
All right,
number 2.
Moving on.
Is that?
Two.
Are we working down in?
Yeah,
popularity?
we're going from the good ones to the bad ones.
Okay, number 2.
So I love a girl band, right? Like the Spice Girls came out when I was probably 13, 14, and it was a pivotal moment in my development. Bardo. Some of your people might remember Bardo.
Yeah, that was off the TV. The coming out of the TV show.
Bananarama, the Shantuzis. So our next musical act is a girl band. There's like 3 or 4 of them. They're on stage. They're wearing cocktail dresses, dressed in really smooth music. All right. Welcome to the stage, the Synthetic Diamonds.
Hey.
Am I right?
Not bad.
And talk about a band that would be controversial.
Yeah. And I
public
just
opinion.
think it works better than the synthetic graphite. It doesn't really work. So moving on, like Matt, I reckon you're into the heavy stuff, right? I can see you like.
Oh no, you wouldn't believe it. Just cold chisel. anything that
really?
reeks of beer. That is I'm a beer band guy.
I had you pegged as someone who'd wear like a corn beanie or like be into Limp Bizkit or something like that.
No, don't underestimate my love for Lady Gaga and Pink. Anyway, yes, continue.
So please, like, think of those sorts of like really tough bands, the bands that like really try to scare you. Like everyone's in their black t-shirt. You've watched Korn. You've had Limp Bizkit. Welcome to the stage, Comminution Circuit.
Oh, love it. It's like the metallurgy genre.
How hard would they rock? People would get beaten up at Comminution Circuit. Now next, like probably playing at a similar festival to Comminution Circuit, but on a different stage because they're a bit more like sort of your punk rockers. They're a bit cooler, a bit sort of younger, a bit, the music's half satire. So, you've listened to everything that Blink-182's got to do. You've listened to Sum 41. You've listened to Third Eye Blind. Now, welcome to the stage, 249D Resolution.
Oh, Jesus Christ, that's getting my vote. 249D.
And believe it or not, my list of top 5 only has 4, so I'm actually out.
Oh, there you go.
Comminution Circuit gets my vote.
No, I'm going 249D Resolution. Love it, yeah! Rock on! Now, and now we are on the fucking lookout for these names now. That is like at the forefront of my mind, everything I read now. I'm not going to take any information in. I'm just going to be looking for rock band names.
maybe your listeners, maybe you could throw up one of those T-shirts or something you have. Like your listeners who comes in with the best one over summer gets one.
There, good thinking, Curry. Mate,
you're doing our guerrilla marketing for us. I love it.
Well, no, it's all their marketing department's going to be running us soon anyway. So
synergies.
Mate, Curry, mate, wishing you and all your counterparts and even people that didn't turn up like Anthony McDonald a very Merry Christmas, mate. And that was a fantastic yarn as always, mate.
Merry Christmas, Pete.
Thanks, Kerry, mate.
Thank you for having me, and well done to you guys. The world's best mining podcast.
Thanks,
You've done
mate.
it. So
appreciate
congrats.
it.
You're too kind.
Helps when we've got no competition.
Beauty.
Do we have, is anyone doing it? No, not in Australia. It makes me wonder, are we doing the right thing?
Hoodaroo, money miners.
Hoodaroo, Curry.
See ya.
Good stuff, mate. Thank you very much. Is there police coming in soon for an interrogation?
The telephone books are going to come in.
Last show of the year.
That's a wrap.
Oh, there you go. Fuck, I can't wait to play golf.
Hard earned, mate. We have a massive, massive thank you to a whole bunch of partners as we sign
not
off the
just
year.
these ones, but everyone that was a partner through the year. I haven't got that list.
Not just them.
Everyone
the
that
money
tuned
miners
in.
for listening to the show.
Yeah.
Massive thank you for enduring our content for the entire year. We look forward to doing it again next year. We're super grateful for the wicked audience that we have. We love you. I love you.
Can't thank you enough. Totally indebted. Mineral Mining Services. Thank you to MMS. Same goes for Grounded, Sandvik Ground
Love
Support,
them too.
CRE Insurance,
Love them.
K-Drill,
Love them.
Dash Sat,
Love them. Love them.
Saltbush Contracting,
Love them.
Love them.
and last but certainly not least, Get Wet Solutions.
Love you, Matty Hall.
Hoodaroo, money miners.
Hoodaroo.
Love you.
The information contained in this episode of Money of Mine is of general nature only and does not take into account the objectives, financial situation or needs of any particular person. Before making any investment decision, you should consult with your financial advisor and consider how appropriate the advice is to your objectives, financial situation and needs.